Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Voices of Forestry podcast. I'm your host, Seth Stephenson, the communications coordinator with the Arkansas Forestry Association. And today we are back with yet another new topic, a new voice of forestry, actually, and a new discussion. This week, we're going to be talking about the product life cycle, the forestry product life cycle today with our guest. And before we introduce who that person is, I want to give a special shout out and a thank you to our sponsors this month, F&W Forestry. We appreciate them for their support of the show. And we're going to hear a little bit more from them later on in this episode. But for now, let me introduce Marshall Thomas, the president of F&W Forestry. He's our guest this month. Marshall, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here, Seth.
Awesome. Now, Marshall, since you are new, we do like to kind of get a little bit of an introduction on your professional history. So can you just inform the people of who you are, what you've done, and how you ended up in this position as president of F&W?
Sure. I was born and raised in Florida, one of the few, went to the University of Florida. So for all you hogs, I hate to tell you, but I'm a Gator, and got a forestry degree from Florida in 1978. I'm one of the few people that has spent his whole career with one company, that's F&W. I actually worked for F&W the year before I graduated, and they offered me a job, and I started with them in April of 1978. Became the president in 1988. That was after I got an MBA at Georgia Southern. I was working in East Georgia and went to night school and got an MBA. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is stuff I learned in business school, applied to our forest business. So my professional history is really intertwined with F&W because I've been with them my whole career. So took over in 1988, and since then we've expanded operations across most of the United States, Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay, and South America, the United Kingdom, and France.
So, Marshall, what we're here to talk about today, you said you kind of learned getting your MBA in business school, and it's the forest product or forest industry life cycle. And you've given a presentation on stuff like this multiple times, I'm sure, because you sent a presentation over to me when we were first talking about this. So there are a lot of graphs and a lot of charts in that presentation. So we're going to have to paint a bit of a word picture for our listeners this month on some of these. But I guess to really start it off, we should probably talk about what exactly there's a kind of generic product life cycle chart graph, if you will, that kind of applies to a lot of things. Can you just explain that product industry life cycle?
Yeah, the product life cycle is a concept that was developed by and reported in the Harvard Business Review first in 1965, and it's become an integral part of how companies manage their businesses. It's evolved over the years, but I always go back to the original definition. And it's a way to explain what happens to a product when you introduce it, and to talk about the phases that a product goes through as it's introduced, gains acceptance, and matures and declines. So those are the phases of the product life cycle. The initial phase is development, where you come up with the product, you invest in it. Then you go through the growth phase, where you introduce the product to the market, people like it, and they start buying it. So this is usually a very rapid growth phase. And then as the product matures, the curve flattens out, and all products go through this cycle. Eventually, the product begins to decline. The product can decline because people don't like it anymore. A better product comes along. You run out of the raw material to make the product. There's a lot of reasons why a product can decline, but all products go through this life cycle. As I said, companies use this to manage their businesses. So a classic example is detergent manufacturers. So they like to keep their product in the growth phase, because the growth phase is where you typically are increasing market share, and you have pretty good products because people like your product better than others. It's new. So classic example of how industries use this is new and improved laundry detergent. That's why you constantly see the new and improved. They're trying to get out ahead of their competitors, get you to buy theirs, and shift themselves up and down the growth phase of the product life cycle. Now, all industries are composed of products. So an industry, since it has multiple products, can actually last longer than a single product, because you have the sum of those curves: development, growth, maturation, and decline. And an industry may make a very similar product, use the same raw materials, but will manage to extend its life over a much longer time than any one product. A classic example of that we're all familiar with would be the naval stores industry, which is composed of several different products. The first product was gum naval stores made from the gum harvested from longleaf and slash pine. That industry lasted from 1850 to really 1970, 1980, peaked in the early 1900s. It ultimately was replaced first by what they call distilled or distillate naval stores, which is Hercules Manufacturing Company. They would dig the old longleaf pine and slash pine stumps out of the ground, distill them, and take the naval stores out of that. So that started replacing gum naval stores because it was more efficient and because we were running out of stumps. And then ultimately, we found out the paper industry, pulp and paper industry, found out that they could extract naval stores during the pulping process. So that is now how we get all of our naval stores. So if you look at the naval stores industry as a whole, it started in the early 1800s and it's still with us. You've had several different products: gum naval stores, distilled naval stores, and now the sulfates are the primary source of that. So that's the product life cycle and the industry life cycle.
And you kind of hinted at it a little bit too. That life cycle can be prolonged or staved off. The decline section of it can be staved off from new products being created and introduced into the marketplace, correct?
Yes, and that's what a healthy industry will do, is continually evaluating what it's doing. All industries know this, so they know you go through these phases. So they constantly are trying to come up with, similar products, new, maybe a little bit better, to keep themselves in that growth or mature phase of the product life cycle.
Okay, so I guess this might sound like a weird question, but in regards to the forestry industry, who exactly is out there looking at making these new products, and how are they getting them accepted into the marketplace?
It's a combination of new players, new people entering the industry, and existing industry. So, for example, on one of the big brights. By the way, the reason, Seth, I want to make sure everybody understands this. The reason this is of interest is if you look at the pulp and paper industry in the United States and in the South, it shows all the signs of being in the decline phase of the product life cycle. This is partly regulatory. We haven't built a paper mill and a pulp mill in the U.S. Since 1984. Because the regulations have gotten so tough. So while the pulp and paper industry worldwide is expanding, we're losing it in the U.S. So the reason this is a really interesting topic is we're seeing that industry in decline. We're losing our small wood markets, and we're desperate for something new to come along. Now, as I said, that could come either from the pulp and paper industry by reinventing themselves, and I'll give a few examples of how they're doing that in just a minute. But it can come from new people. So the new people are the ones that are most exciting to me, are the producers of sustainable aviation fuel, something to replace Jet A, and methanol to replace the bunker fuel that's burned in the big ocean-going ships. Those are being funded by the airlines in the case of sustainable aviation fuel, and by the big shipping companies in the case of methanol. So these are new people coming in saying, hey, we're part of this transition to a green economy. We know that we're putting carbon in the air. We know we've got to shift. And they've identified trees as a possible source of either the fuel for aircraft or the fuel for those big ships. So that one is really exciting to me because they'll use small wood, they'll use pulp wood, and they'll put those plants all over the South near the ports. And fortunately, we're all over the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast. So we're in a great position for them to replace or at least supplement the pulp and paper industry in terms of small wood markets. Okay, another one, wood heating and electricity. That's going to be power companies, and the way they're doing that is is it's wood heating and making wood heat and steam and electricity by burning the wood, but then capturing the carbon that comes off of that and pumping it into the ground. So we're starting to see some of that, and these tend to be new entrants into the market. Although the pulp and paper industry is a potential participant, and I think they may be starting to look at this as well. These are a few that I think are really neat. Here's an example of what Westrock is doing. We all know the problem with the six-pack containers that Coca-Cola and beer and all those things come in. They wind up in the ocean, and we've all seen the pictures of sea turtles with their head ensnared in that ring that never goes away. The plastic takes forever to degrade. Well, Westrock has figured out how to make a degradable substitute for those rings. So they can put it on beer containers, and when you throw it away, if it winds up in the ocean, it's going to dissolve. It goes away. So this to me is, I think a huge opportunity that pulp and paper is looking at is, can we take those carbon chains that that's what the pulping process does, breaks it down into carbon chains. Can they take those and make plastic replacements? And this is just one example that I think is really neat. Food grade paper to replace styrofoam. Like, you have the styrofoam under the meat that you buy in the grocery store. People are trying to figure out how to do that with paper. That would be the paper companies doing that. Paper bottles. Heinz Ketchup is trying to come up with a paper ketchup bottle to replace the plastic ones. I like to talk about these new products for landowners, not necessarily for our industry, but water easements. There's been some cases in over on the eastern side of Georgia and the Atchafalaya River Basin in South Carolina, where people are able to commercialize water easements. Manufacturers are starting to get credit for carbon that go into some of these products, or into mass timber buildings, for example. They're able to sell those carbon credits. So Seth, it's a long list. It's really exciting. The problem we got, and I think we'll discuss this a little later, is as the pulp and paper industry is declining and that demand is declining, for us forest landowners, the tree growers, we need these new industries to get in there quick, and we need the pulp and paper industry to reposition itself.
And I think we are going to talk about this a little bit later, but we'll kind of tease it. But that's going to take teamwork and communications and working together with a lot of different people to make sure we get there, right?
It is going to be it's going to take a team effort, and we got an example from history to support that I think is really neat. We'll talk about that later.
Sounds great. Sounds great, Marshall. I love these teases that we're going to have later on in the show. So this is great. Well, so Marshall, you mentioned that the pulp and paper industry is kind of in a declining phase, but is that really where we're at with the forest? Is that kind of encapsulate the forest products life cycle where we currently are? Are we just in that declining phase, or is it just that one sector of the forest products industry?
It is one sector. The reason I emphasize it is it's such a large sector, and because that small wood is so critical to our ability to sustainably manage our southern forest. So I emphasize that a little bit. But lumber, interesting, is a really interesting story. I like to go back in history. I'm a big history buff. And if you go back in the history of the lumber industry in the South, the first boom was in the early 1900s. Started in the mid 1800s, boomed in the early 1900s, and shut down when the Depression hit. Combination of a decrease in demand, but we'd also cut all the big trees. It was a cut and get out period, no forest management. And we cut through the resource, and the industry had to shut down. But the first big boom was in the early 1900s. We did not produce lumber at that same level in the South until the mid 1990s. A lot of people don't realize that. It started coming back in the 1960s. If you think about it, it shut down in the 30s. 30 years later, we got big trees again. Here it comes, and it's been increasing ever since. And if you look at that in the context of the product life cycle curve, the lumber industry is growing, and I don't see any signs of decline. We've had all the Canadian sawmills move down here because they are declining. They're running out of resource. Same thing's happening in the Western states. So we've got tons of resource, and people are building mills. I think that's going to continue in the growth phase. Could be approaching maturity, but we've got way more raw material than they're cutting. So I think we
Hmm.
can sustain growth in the lumber industry for a while. Panels, that's another interesting one because we started with wafer board, it's gone away. Plywood boomed, and then OSB came along. So if you look at those curves, it's the panel industry. You'll see that it grew in the 50s and 60s and has been stable and growing ever since. But with new products,
Hmm.
plywood, OSB, all the other similar panel products are making that up. It's interesting though, because for those panel products, they took a big hit in 2008 and have not really recovered. But I attribute that mostly to the problems that we're having in the housing industry. So I think we'll see panels recover and probably continue to grow. So yes, there are a lot of bright spots, but on the small tree side, it's a pretty negative looking story right now.
Yeah, that is usually the one thing that we hear a lot from our members is the pulp prices for their trees is just abysmal. And I'm sure you've seen that and have heard that from others as well. So this is all kind of making sense that it's because it's in that decline phase is why they're seeing such little return for their long-term investments.
Yes, and it's getting serious. There's parts of the South where it's very difficult to even get a stand thinned. You planted your plantation anticipating a market for thinning because, gosh, we have such a long window we have to plan for, and
Mm-hmm.
it's rough. So yeah, that's why I get so excited about the sustainable aviation fuel and the methanol for the big ships because they address that issue.
Okay. Well, Marshall, I'll tell you what, this feels like a pretty good stopping point for our ad break. So we're going to take a quick break right here and hear a little bit more from your company, F&W Forestry. F&W Forestry Services has been maximizing the value and enjoyment of clients' land since 1962. Whether the objectives are economic, aesthetic, environmental, or recreational, they work with landowners to create a personalized plan for success. With offices throughout the U.S., including in El Dorado, F&W's knowledgeable forestry professionals are familiar with regional markets and provide services at the local level. They are proud of their reputation for consistently providing quality results and handling timber sales, property management, field support, forest inventory and mapping, real estate, and forest land accounting. So whether you are a private landowner or a large organization, F&W has the experience to serve your needs. To learn more about F&W, visit their website at fwforestry.com. Thank you once again to F&W Forestry for their support of the show. So, Marshall, as we enter the back half here of our discussion, I want to kind of look on a bigger scale real quick. And how exactly does the perception of the industry, our forest industry, affect its life cycle, if at all?
It's this is something, Seth, that was an interesting outcome of my application of the product life cycle to the forest industry. And I started that process because of all the mill closures.
Mm-hmm.
It just raised, I studied that concept in business school, and I was actually asked to speak to an association, and they asked me to talk about, what's going on with the mill closures. And so I thought, well, I'll use the product life cycle to try to explain that. And it's really interesting, and it explains it. But in the course of doing my research, I read a book called The Greening of the South, and
Mm-hmm.
it talks about how the South recovered from the big lumber boom, because just like is happening in some areas now, when all those big sawmills shut down back then, there was unemployment everywhere. But it was even beyond the forest products industry back then. The entire South was still in that uh, post-depression depression. The South came out much slower than the rest of the country. And I ran into several stories, and I'd heard some of these stories myself, but hadn't really pieced them together into the big picture. And it kind of centers around a guy named Charles Hurdy, who was the chemist. Uh, I think he came out of North Carolina, was a professor at the University of Georgia. He actually happened to be the first football coach at the University of Georgia in the 1890s. Uh, there's still a street up there on, I'm a Gator, remember, but there's still
Hmm.
a street up there on the campus called Hurdy Way or something like that. But Hurdy was a chemist, and he got into the naval stores industry and came up with some ways to uh, improve the way gum naval stores were processed. But he also was a bit of a social activist, and he got into this idea. He knew the South was suffering economically, and he knew we had this huge resource of trees. And he started saying, "Hey, if we can turn these trees into paper, we can use that to recover the South." And he managed to raise some money from the Georgia legislature and from a group called the Chemical Foundation or something like that. I guess a group in Georgia that was interested in that stuff. And a local businessman there in Savannah, Georgia, and they built a miniature pulp and paper mill there. And the purpose of this was to figure out a way to make white paper out of southern pines. We could make craft paper, brown paper, like for paper bags,
Hmm.
but it was still difficult. And the reason it was difficult was the resin. All the pulping processes came out of northern Europe and the northern U.S., and they weren't used to dealing with the resin that we have in the southern pines. So he thought we can figure this out, and if we can figure this out, we've got the resource to help the South recover from this depression. And they did. He got the money, built that miniature pulping machine and paper machine, and within a year they were making newsprint. That was the first big one. It was
Wow.
white paper, newsprint. Some local paper there in Savannah bought the first run and printed their uh, uh, paper on it. It was a big deal, announcing, hey, we can make newsprint out of the southern pines. This is what. So first, the first interesting thing is, Purdy was an activist, so he gets
Mhm.
together the money to do the research. And $100,000 back then, I hadn't even done the conversion, but I guess I'm going to say that was a lot of money.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Um, but I've heard these other stories. The Langdale family in South Georgia, for example. I've heard Wesley Langdale talk about how his great grandfather, had realized they needed small wood markets and had put together community groups in that region to attract paper mills, and I've also heard about the Crosby family doing the same thing in Louisiana, that they got the whole community together. They rallied the community. That would be the state government, the local community, to say, hey, we've got what you need. We can make newsprint. Please bring it here. We'll get you the wood. So yes, all of a sudden, in doing my research, I saw that it wasn't just. I've always heard Charles Hurdy came up with a way to do it, and I thought, okay, he solved the chemical problem and industry moved to the South, but it wasn't that way. He solved a chemical problem, but it took this community effort to attract the industry. It took a vision to say, we've got the raw material, the country and the world needs the products that we have, and we're going to bring those things together and make it happen. And guess what happens? 115 paper mills were built in the South from the 1930s to the 1980s. In
Wow.
today's dollars, a paper mill costs $3 billion. Think about what that meant to the South and to the economic recovery of the rural South. It was huge. But yes,
Hmm.
and answer your question, back then it was a community effort. And I think that's something we need to learn now, that we've got the same resource that they had back then, but it's going to take forestry associations, state legislatures, influential individuals, all coming together to say, we've got the resource, and the product we want now are the products that help the world transition to that green economy. The world says they want to do that. We've got the stuff that'll do it. So we've got to get the state legislatures and all the opinion leaders in the South on board with this to make it happen.
So that actually is kind of a perfect transition into the next question that I wanted to talk to you about in talking about kind of a bigger picture of forestry, is that our world is just constantly getting bigger with more demand for things like food, energy, fiber. Does the forest or the wood products industry fit in to just solve these problems that you've kind of mentioned with, like, for instance, the plastic rings on sodas, or the carbon sequestration stuff that we've been talking about a lot here in the last couple of years, is it just to help make the earth more green, or is there more to it than that?
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, we've got offices in Europe. So I get exposed to a lot of how they think over there. And we all know, I think we've all heard of the Paris Accord, which was to
Mm-hmm.
move towards a carbon neutral economy by a certain date. That Paris is, of course, in Europe. So I think they tend to think a little bit further down the road than we do in this regard. And they talk a lot about the green transition, or the transition to a green economy. Green economy means a carbon neutral economy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we have the raw material that's ideal to support the world's desire to transition to a green economy. We've got a product that actually is a manufacturing plant before it becomes a product, and that's a tree. And what that tree does is takes carbon out of the air and sequesters it first in the tree, in the bowl of the tree. And then later, after the manufacturing plant sequesters all this carbon, we're able to harvest that tree and on a basic level, cut it into a board and sequester it. More complex, break it into paper and sequester it if it goes into a landfill. But then what we're really doing is breaking it all down into carbon chains. And carbon chains are what we can make all these other products from. So I like to say that we have the most cost-effective way to grab carbon out of the air and convert it to a carbon chain. And just as Hurdy saw there was a chemical problem back then to be solved, all we got to do is make sure that the folks who want to make all these products have the incentives, the legislative green lights, the business climate green lights to know that they can come into our communities, use that product and make these things and help the world transition to this green economy that we're all after. So regardless of where you are on climate change, I think what we got is a really neat product that takes carbon out of the air so that we can do other things with it. So it's carbon neutral energy. It sequesters carbon. In other words, the world says they want those products and carbon sequestration, and we got the material to do it. So yes, Seth, I think the South is uniquely positioned to do that, but it's up to us to take advantage of it. And I think it's going to take some effort to do that.
Okay. Well, before we kind of get into some of that real quick, I want to ask you probably a dumb question, since you did list off a slew of new innovations that have been made in our industry, and new ideas that have occurred throughout time. But is it harder to be innovative in today's world? I'm sure you've heard the saying, there's no such thing as a novel idea anymore. But is it harder for folks like our members, or our big industry members, to be innovative?
Um, that's a great question, and I think that especially in the context of what we're talking about, yes. And you ask about your big industry members. I think it's very difficult for them to put a lot of money into new technologies that may or may not pan out. They're
Mm-hmm.
publicly traded corporations. As I said earlier, they're in the decline phase in the US. Corporations that are in the decline phase typically face steep competition. Their margins are low, so that their free cash is limited. Their shareholders want dividends. And so it's hard to say, hey, we're going to take all your dividends for the next 10 years and try to develop some kind of a sustainable fuel. So yes, I think it's difficult in that sense to finance that kind of research,
Mm-hmm.
speculative research. So this is where I think, sometimes I think there's a real case for government stepping in when you have these very high risk ventures and doing a little bit of the R&D up front. And we used to have a huge R&D effort at the U.S. Forest Service Products Research Lab, whatever they called it. It's almost been shut down, but they're starting to rebuild that, which is great. So this is part of that community effort I was talking about
Mm-hmm.
earlier. If they can redevelop this Forest Service development lab, maybe they can start doing some of this stuff, and then industry can grab it when it's a little bit further down the road.
So the
These
whole
are
weight,
complex. Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry,
I'm
I was
sorry.
gonna say the whole, the burden, the weight of the burden isn't squarely on one company's shoulders to kind of figure something out, right? Correct?
I think that's the way it has to be. That it's going to have to
Yeah.
be a combination of private sector research, private entities, which can take a little more risk, public
Mm-hmm.
entities, I mean, publicly traded entities, our paper companies and our
Mm-hmm.
sawmills, and then the government. I think the government has a very much of a role here because it's a public policy issue to move to the green economy. So when it becomes that kind of a public policy issue, I think it's incumbent on the government to break down some of those barriers, not only by doing some of the research, putting some dollars into research, but also by breaking down the barriers to the publicly traded companies and private entities to, by providing incentives and other means to get them to help meet the public policy objectives.
So Marshall, we've come to the big question of the episode, if you will. What's next? What do we need to do, or whose responsibility even is it to try to make sure that the pulp and paper industry gets out of this decline phase, or that other sectors in our forest industry, forest products industry, don't hit that level of the life cycle? What happens now? Is it just taking a page from Mr. Hurdy's book and trying to drum up support from community and government and other entities, or what? I guess what needs to happen, in your opinion?
I think the real issue we're dealing with is I think we've got a healthy economy long term. I think our our business is going to be very healthy. The problem we're having right now, as we mentioned earlier, with the decline in pulp and paper, decline in demand for those small trees that we grow, and not having all these new products operational is creating this gap. The same gap that happened in between when the big sawmilling boom of the early 1900s stopped and before the pulp and paper industry got going. So I think our job right now is we can either sit back and say it's going to happen and it might take 20 years, or Seth, to your point, we can get to work and say we need to raise public awareness that we have the solution to this green economy right here, and that we can help the world move to that green economy while creating tax base and jobs in the rural South. And I think we've got to start getting that message across. I will give you an example. The Georgia Forestry Association
Mm-hmm.
just got the Georgia Senate to appoint a study committee to look into this very subject. So they're looking at how they can help facilitate. Really, they're focused very much on that sustainable aviation fuel because of the Atlanta airport,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Oh yeah.
Largest passenger airport in the world. So how ideal if we could make sustainable aviation fuel in Georgia for that airport. But so I think that's what's got to happen is raising public awareness that we're part of the solution, and then getting our state legislatures to figure out how to drop barriers. And one thing I like to emphasize is while pulp and paper may be in decline, they are the ideal partner for us and our legislators to start converting their sites to some of these new products because they're already up and running. So, I always like to say, focus on the new stuff, but don't forget the guys that got us here.
Mm-hmm.
They're very much a part of the solution. So I think what needs to happen is we need to start raising awareness that we're part of the solution about the green economy, not pushing it that we need markets, but that we're the solution. You guys want all this green stuff. We've got the raw material that can make it, and we can do it in such a way that benefits the citizens of our state by keeping our forests sustainably managed, providing the raw material necessary to produce all these green products to get us to a carbon neutral economy. So that's what I think needs to happen.
And this may sound, no duh, Seth, coming from a communicator, professional communicator, but it's all about the messaging. It's all about the wording that we're using. Like you said, it's not necessarily advocating for markets, but advocating that we are the solution. There's got to be a certain unified messaging across the forestry industry because we're all in it together, no matter what state we come from. But we all got to be communicating the same thing to the people that can help us get to where we need to be in the future.
I agree with that, Seth. It does have to be common messaging. And I think what you said is critical because if we say, hey, we need markets, it's just self-serving. It's like any other
Mm-hmm.
business group that goes to the state legislature and says, hey, do something to give us more business. But if we can walk in and say, you can make Jet A out of the stuff we grow, or you can make methanol, or the pulp and paper industry, if they're properly motivated and there's a friendly business climate to them, if they're sent the right message, may be willing to invest in creating some of these new products themselves. So yeah, I think new green products. So I think what you just said is so important that we need to portray ourselves as a solution and an opportunity, not that we're in need.
Okay. Well, Marshall, is there anything else you'd like to add or you want to say before we kind of wrap this up?
No, Seth, I just appreciate the opportunity to get on here and give you all my opinions.
No, hey, and we appreciate you being willing to do so. So not everyone is as willing as you were. I know, I think Max was telling me that we missed you a couple years ago at our annual meeting. Something came up. So when he found out, he's like, oh, you can get Marshall Thomas, get Marshall Thomas. So thank you so much for joining us this month.
My plane, I was in Albany and I was coming in at the last minute on a plane flight the night before, and the flight was
Mm-hmm.
canceled and it was too late to get to Atlanta. And I would have had to drive all night to get there. And I just decided I wasn't going to do that. So
Probably the smart move, probably the
yeah,
smart move for sure. So, well, Marshall, again, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. And hopefully we can get you back on maybe in the future to continue this conversation or have a new one. So thank you so much.
good talking, Seth.
And we want to thank you guys for joining us as well. As always, we want to give a special shout out and thank you to some guy named Rob / Rob McCormick for the use of our theme song, The Same Love. That's off of his album, The Folkster. You can find more of his music on Spotify. And as always, we've got a link to his website where you can find show information and more of his music in the description of this episode. We also want to thank F&W Forestry once again for their support this month. Thank you to them for supporting this show. And make sure you come back next month and we'll have a new topic, a new discussion, and a new Voice of Forestry.